Hello, everyone. Welcome to the EstesGroup Prophet 21 User Summit. I'm going to wait a few moments while some folks come in before we get started. But yeah, just wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for being here. All right, I am going to get started, but for anyone that comes in late, we'll remind you a few times, this is going to be recorded, so if there's anything that you miss or a session that you cannot make, just let me know and we can get you a recording of that later. But yeah, so today we have some familiar faces that some of you may have worked with already and some new faces. So I'm going to get into a little bit about what EstesGroup does very briefly, and then I'll make some introductions. All right, so EstesGroup, what are we up to? We have several different departments. We have ERP, private cloud, and managed hosting. We also have a managed IT services department, endpoint security, backup and disaster recovery, remote worker support. And then, of course, we do ERP implementations, application consulting, business process optimization, ERP installation and tuning. If there's ever anything that you're curious about that we do not cover, feel free to ask a question, reach out to us later, and we can get you information on what we do, or give you a little bit more input if we don't cover it today. So today we're going to have myself on here. I'm a customer account manager. I've worked with some of you before, some of you I have not. So excited to get to know some new faces and catch up with some others, or I guess names today. And then we of course have Daryl Sirota. He's our Executive Technical Services Director. And then we have Terri Gage. She is our Senior Consultant for Prophet 21. And Jim Fry, who I've known for a good while, he's Enterprise Sales Director over at SourceStay. And today's agenda, we're going to be going over Epicor server best practices for the Prophet 21 environment. I'll jumble up a couple words today, so bear with me. Daryl Sirota is going to be going over that with you guys. And at each end of each session, we'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions. And then 11 to 12, the creation of Prophet 21 financial statements using Financial Line Express with Terri Gage. And then we'll be going into bridging the gap between Epicor and suppliers for distribution companies with Jim Fry from SourceStay. And then at the very end, we'll have a 30-minute time slot reserved for some questions that you might have that came up during, or that you maybe pocketed before you even got here. And we'll try to address those as best as we can. And like I said, all of this will be recorded. So if there's something that you miss out on, or if you ever have any input for a future session, we would love to hear back from you on that. All right, so the format. Some of you have been in some meetings similar to this, so you kind of know, but for those that want a little input on some tools that are available, those sessions that are 45 minutes, there'll be tools available where you can ask those questions, raise a hand, etc. And then at the end of each session, we'll take a 5-minute break. I'll come back and I'll ask you a question that's sort of related to the upcoming presentation you're going to see in a poll. We'll go over that, and then I'll introduce our presenters. So, and then obviously there's a chat box as well. If you are having any issues, it doesn't have to be a question. It could be, hey, I can't hear something. So let us know if you're having any issues. All right, so first up we have Daryl Sirota, and he's going to be going over server best practices, but I believe that we have a poll to share prior to that. So I'm going to share the poll, get some feedback, and then I'll introduce Daryl quickly. So let me... And my apologies, everyone. I am not seeing my usual share poll area. So if somebody could help me share that poll, please. There we go. Thank you very much. So we'll give you a few moments to answer that. Thank you to my helper, whoever that was.
Good morning, Cindy. A little bit of tech support here from the technical geek.
Awesome, wonderful. Well, let me do a quick introduction of Daryl then, and I'll let him take over. And if we could share those results momentarily, and while Daryl's doing his presentation, I'll do some damage control on that and have it sorted for next time. So our first presentation is going to be with Daryl. He is our Executive Technical Service Director at EstesGroup and leads our technical team. He has over 35 years of IT experience in both cybersecurity, along with network, server, and database admin. He works to build and maintain the server architectures that serve as the foundation of our Echo managed hosting platform. And he will be talking to you today about some server best practices as they relate to a P21 ecosystem. And with that, here is Daryl.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Cindy. Appreciate that. Hopefully y'all can hear me. If you can't hear me, let me know. Raise a hand or something like that. I'll go through. And I have lots of good stuff to share. So good morning, all. Welcome to the I'm gonna call it the most technical part of the conversation here today, because I'm more on the infrastructure side. My official title is Director of Technology Services here at the EstesGroup, and I deal with speeds and feeds and servers and bits and bytes and those kinds of things. And I thought I would bring to you the benefit of my 35 years of expertise in managing Windows servers as it relates to P21. So what I'd like to do here is start death by PowerPoint. Actually, no, I'm just kidding. I really don't like to do death by PowerPoint, but I have a lot of good information. I want to share it with you. Again, we are sharing this presentation afterwards. So if you want to grab your notebook and start taking notes, that might be helpful. I don't have all of the information here in this slide deck, but let's go ahead and share it out here. So with that in mind, you all should now see my best practices for your P21 servers. Yes? Okay, well, great. Let's go move forward then. I don't see anybody saying no, so I think that's perfect. Okay, so lots of good stuff here. So first thing I want to talk about is at the very high level, I need to talk about some of the things that are going to make your life easier as you continue your P21 journey. We're going to talk about servers, which is certainly the primary part of my conversation. Wanted to also discuss infrastructure, right? Servers are great, but they're not isolatable boxes. You have to connect them together, and the infrastructure is the wiring, so to speak, to put that in. The application itself, not within the P21 application, because we've got Jim and Terri here on the webinar today that are much more experienced than I am within the application. However, your application P21 lives as a SQL server and a middleware server and maybe terminal servers and all sorts of good stuff. And those applications are something that we want to make sure that you have a clear understanding on how to best manage those support of the P21 client. I did want to mention change management, always a challenge, certainly as we go through with the rapid changes we're seeing in the P21 space, as well as, you know, Windows keeps updating their stuff and things like that. Change management is a key part of any ERP system. And then I did want to talk a little bit about server location, and that is where do you have your options of putting all of these servers that we're about to talk about, and some of the pros and cons about where those servers might be. If at any point you have any questions, you are free to post in the Q&A session. If I look over this way, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because I'm looking at the Q&A tab. And I'll certainly leave time at the end of my presentation for a more boisterous conversation, as it were, about my topic. Okay, so servers, first off, when we look at a server environment, we have a couple of different architectures that we look at. First, most ERP solutions run in a 3-tiered model at this point. Now, for those 50% of you that are still running the legacy or the fat client, as opposed to the 30% running the web client and the 40% running the hybrid client, most ERP solutions run in this three-tiered model where we've got the SQL database living on one box, physical or virtual. We've got the application server, often called the middleware server in P21 lingo, living as another box, and then the user interface. And that user interface, whether it's the old legacy client, whether it's the legacy client installed in an RDP farm, whether it's the browser, or a variety of different ways. There's lots of different user interfaces to P21. But those three different levels are typically what any modern solution is laid out in. So depending on the size and the volume of transactions and the availability that you need, you might have a couple of different ways that you configure these three-tiered models. Now, keep in mind that the old legacy P21 was set up as a two-tiered model. That is, there was a SQL server and all the little users connected to that via the legacy client. So therefore, in that original environment, it was just a two-tiered model. As we move into the newer flavor, we definitely have the three-tiered model. So you could have put that database and middleware application on a single OS. However, that's not recommended. It gives the machine a split personality. So Epicor has clearly recommended, note your SQL server and your middleware server needs to be two separate boxes. They could be two separate virtual machines on the same physical hardware, but we need to take a look at some of that, and we'll talk about that later. You probably have them separated as three separate servers, okay, or three separate environments. We have a SQL server, we have a middleware server, and then you have all your user interface, whether it's installed on the local workstation or it's deployed via an RDP farm. Is up to you and the type of client that you're using. For the purists out there, I understand that there are some companies that go, we never do anything in production without first doing it in test. If you have three servers in production, well, then by definition, in that purist attitude, you've got to have three other servers for test, okay? Which is fine, and I love that because it completely separates production from test. So you can reboot the test server, you can change the test server share permissions, you can change the test server SQL version, and it doesn't impact production. So you know exactly what's going on in test before you do it in production. However, maintaining those 6 different servers for some companies might be a challenge. And so therefore we see some common combinations. Like for example, it is not unusual in the P21 space to have a common SQL server. As you might know, SQL is licensed typically in what they call a per processor or per core mode. Every 4 cores that you present to a SQL server, Microsoft makes a little bit, or if you have Enterprise Edition, a lot of money. And by being able to combine the test environment, the production environment into the same SQL server, you can save a whole lot in licensing costs. I have seen where we have separate instances for production and another instance for test, somewhat differentiating those 2 environments, even on the same physical box. Additional instances don't cost any more Microsoft licensing. So that's kind of a handy thing. You could use a common RDP farm. If you're using an RDP farm, it's really easy to install 2 P21 clients, one for production, one for test. In fact, a lot of you probably have 1 P21 client with 2 profiles, one for production and one for test. And that's great as long as you're running the same version of P21 in production and test. But if you're testing an upgrade to the latest version of P21, there's probably a corresponding client upgrade. So you might have 2 separate clients, 2 separate locations on the file system for those 2 clients to, again, split test and production. You could have a common application server. And this is something where you basically have one middleware server and it's got a live install and a test install and we have a lot of clients that have 3, 4, 5 different applications installed on that one application server. However, there is a challenge there in that it's easy to, I call it cross-contaminate reports and other common folders. If your test environment uses the same folder structure as your production environment, then it can be a little confusing as to what crystal report you're testing, right? If you upgraded it to crystal report and it's called the same thing in production and test, and they're both in a common folder, as soon as you upgrade that report, you've done it for both test and production. So again, it's easy kind of cross-contaminate those reports as long as you have a clear idea of what your report names are. and your folder structures are, you can get around that. And that's typically what we see is we have one application server with multiple installs. The smaller companies tend to combine these roles together. The larger companies that have the resources, both in terms of physical machines, licensing, as well as manpower, to be able to support 6 different servers. The larger companies do split them apart because they see the benefit of having an isolated test environment, completely independent from the production environment. So it's kind of important to realize this, because as we build our server architecture, how you combine these things together is going to play out in how you tune and tweak and optimize the systems. So I would like to go forward here and talk a little bit then about this wonderful thing that Epicor is doing to us, or has done to us. This isn't really new, right? Looking at the poll results, 30% of you are running the web client, and 40% are running the hybrid client, and 50% are running the legacy client, which adds up to more than 100%. That's a good thing, because you can actually run them simultaneously. So I just wanted to point out here, what I call the legacy P21 client is actually in Epicor speak called the desktop application. Then there's the web client and or the hybrid client. And these are the newer flavors that Epicor is actively upgrading and adding features to. But I want to talk a little bit more about each of these different clients and what the roles and what load they place on your servers. So when you look at the legacy client, you're typically going to install this directly on the PC, or you're going to install it on an RDP farm. RDP is our remote desktop farm, right? And I say scaled out because if you have a small legacy client deployment with, say, 10 users or less, 15 users or less, you can probably get away with a single RDP server. But if you have more than that 15 user-ish limit, depending on how heavy user they are, you'll find yourself maxing out the resources of any one terminal server or RDP server. And so what you'll need is just to add another RDP server. For example, we have a client that has 150 legacy clients deployed in an RDP farm. They have 17 RDP servers to comfortably support their 150 users. So if you got enough resources to hold 17 RDP servers, like 12 CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM each, great, but that's a significant investment in an RDP farm. The legacy client does communicate directly to SQL. So it's going to talk directly to your SQL server. So if you got the legacy client installed on your desktop or your workstation, know that it's going to be chatting to the SQL server, and you really want a close, high performance connection between your client and that SQL server. In the case of the RDP farm, it's that RDP farm that's talking to the SQL server. The clients are just talking over RDP protocols. And there's some benefits there. We'll talk about that a little bit. The legacy client, of course, has been the traditional client that's been out there for a bazillion years, since long before I got into P21. And that's where you have all your typical or traditional customizations that have gone on in times gone past, right? The Dynachange rules, third-party app development. Some third-party app development did actually piggyback on top of the middleware server. And in that case, in the legacy environment, the middleware server was simply used for maybe your e-commerce application or e-commerce connectivity. Maybe it was only used to support certain third-party programming, because people realized that middleware server was a much better programming endpoint than just trying to start modifying the P21 client directly. However, it is important to note that the version 2021.1 is the last legacy client that Epicor is going to give us. And in fact, after November 30th of next year, even that's not going to get any more fixes. So we have here kind of a drop dead date of the end of next year before the legacy client, while it will still run, it's not going to break just magically after November 30th. So just like Windows 7 continues to run, right? And heaven forbid, if I asked anybody who's still running Windows XP, I would hope no hands go up, but I still see some XP out there. It doesn't break, it just becomes less secure. You don't get the fixes. And so if you have a problem with the P21 legacy client, Epicor is going to be more and more reticent to help you out with that. And we can share a much more detailed article. It's up on Epicor's, the ERP customer website, as to exactly the timeframes on these support models are going to play out. So the legacy client, it's, you know, it's the old standby. However, as we move forward, obviously with the 11/30/22 drop dead dates, the web client is going to be the way to go. Now, the web client is actually two different flavors. You can run the web client in any modern browser, or you can run the hybrid client. And the hybrid client is a Windows or a Mac OS for you Mac users install that you can put on the desktop. And it's just a thin little shim. It auto updates, which is nice. So that way you can push the hybrid client out. It presents a more familiar Windows interface for the end user, even though it is a very different interface from the legacy client. The web client and the hybrid client are a whole lot lighter and easier to deal with from a communication perspective. They communicate with your middleware server. They never talk directly to the SQL server. So when they're communicating with the middleware server, as we'll see in a later slide, they've got some benefits in terms of the protocols used. Of course, the support from the developers and Epicor is where all the attention is going. So if you see new features, for example, there's a new web report tool that's available in the web/hybrid client, both of them, that isn't there in the legacy client. So if you're looking to do web reports and you've written your own custom Crystal reports, you have a third-party tool to do reporting, you might want to look at this new web client tool for the web reporting, and that might make your life easier as you go down the road. So lots of different ways that we can identify the differences between the two clients. There's a great document from Epicor that talks about what are some of the key differences in the web client from the legacy. If you're interested in that, please message me afterwards. I'll make sure that I get that document over to you. Okay, so coming back now to our server best practices. Of course, the server itself is going to be where all your users make it or break it. The hardware resources that you apply to that server are going to determine its overall performance, right? Every server and workstation, for that matter, has four main components: the number of processors, the amount of disk and the speed of the disk, the network pipe that you connect to it, and the amount of RAM or memory that you allocate to it. Now, a lot of clients will simply say, well, more is better. So you know, let's give it 15 CPUs and 75 gigs of RAM. And the problem there is, if you live in a virtual world, if you overcommit your resources, you actually can hurt performance. And by the way, if you give your SQL server more than 4 cores, then you get to pay Microsoft a little bit more in SQL licensing. Now, I've actually found that most SQL servers don't need more than 4 cores, but I've seen a lot of clients that just start throwing CPUs at it to try and make it go faster without doing the appropriate bottleneck or analysis for the bottleneck. And so then when Microsoft comes down and does the Microsoft audit, which some of you might have been the pleasure of receiving, they come down and look at your SQL licensing and go, well, you're running 8 cores, so that means you need 4 2-packs of SQL licenses, and it's a couple of grand. Enterprise licensing, now we're talking enterprise SQL licensing, now we're talking 5 figures, not just 4 figures. One of the big problems I see in a virtualized world is you're not using the appropriate drivers. For those folks that are in the VM world, this is something that when I do most of my P21 discovery calls where clients have deployed P21, they forgot to use the VMX Net3 network driver. This is an optimized driver in the VMware environment. If you're not using it, it's an easy swap. It is downtime. So make sure you have a maintenance window where you can swap out that NIC card in that virtual machine. Also goes true for any other driver that you've got in that world. But in the virtualized world, that VMX Net3 tends to be one of the top pain points that I see in the P21 space. Of course, when you're building your server, you want to follow the Epicor recommended sizing guides. And generally what I do is I start with that guide as a base, and then I tune from there. We have some clients that are small, and they don't need 24 gigs of RAM in their middleware server. And if most of that memory is going to waste, I would rather take it from a VM and give it over to another VM that could use it better. Maybe an RDP server. Definitely the SQL server could always use more RAM because that makes it go faster until your SQL server has enough RAM to cache your entire database. Some clients have very small databases. Other clients I've seen, P21 databases in the order of 200 or 300 gigs. That's kind of difficult to, kind of expensive to put into a single SQL server, and generally not recommended to put 300 gigs of RAM in a SQL server. So there's a key question there that when you hit that tipping point of performance do you, that is your users saying this isn't fast enough? Do you go with scaling up the server or scaling out to more servers? Now, basically that means, scaling up is you add more RAM, you add more CPU, you add more disk to support the user base, and you try and keep all your users squeezed into one server where you don't have one operating system, one license, one thing to worry about. On the other hand, as we've seen in the legacy client, after you get about 15 users on an RDP server, adding more RAM to that box doesn't help. Adding more CPUs doesn't help. You just have to add more servers, more RDP servers in that case. In the middleware environment, we've seen that one middleware server, Epicor, they're a little gray in their recommendations, but typically they say about 50 users on a middleware server, and then you need to scale out. So you're going to add more middleware servers and do this kind of load balancing cool trick to get those additional users into the same P21 space. Now, unfortunately, when we look at this server scaling and performance, one of the key things is to properly monitor it. You can't just turn on the server and just hope it's working properly. So you need the tools, whether it's performance monitor or third-party tools, to be able to watch that server and see, is it maxing out in one resource or another, to decide whether or not you're going to scale up or scale out. That monitoring is a critical part of any server environment. You can't just put it in place and hope it works. So I want to keep that in mind there as far as monitoring is concerned. Now, server security, certainly a big part. I didn't want to drop the ball on this because we've got our disaster recovery and testing of that disaster recovery. It's always great to cry fire and see who responds and restore your servers. I have a lot of clients that say, yes, we do backups, but I've never had to restore from the backup. You should be able to restore your backups, preferably into the test environment so you don't interrupt production, even from bare metal. Right, Microsoft does it to us on a regular basis. Feels like once a year they release a patch that torches the system. So you have to plan for the maintenance window to do the patch. You also have to plan for, what if the patch doesn't do what it's supposed to do? How do you fall back? What's your disaster recovery policy? One of the key things that I've noticed also in your security model is malware protection. You have antivirus. And if your antivirus is not SQL aware, IIS aware, and P21 aware, you might be scanning more than you need. I've seen lots of malware software, malware protection, pardon me, the antivirus tools, and they're scanning SQL databases looking for viruses, and they slow down SQL incredibly. So we want to make sure to do the appropriate exclusions for your antivirus. And there are a number of account best practices. I don't want to dive into the details here, but your P21 application runs with SQL accounts and with Windows accounts to be able to do the middleware stuff. And if you just practice the quote best practices, make sure that you have accounts lockouts turned on, for example. So if you have a hacker in your network, they're just not trying the SA password all day long until they win. You want to make sure that those accounts get locked out. That's both at the Windows level and the SQL level. We have those levels of protection. Don't use administrator. That should really go without saying at this point, because the administrator account, if you have one, the password should be really, really good. And if you change that password, you don't want P21 to break. Those service accounts that you do use, I would strongly recommend don't log in on a regular basis as those service accounts. Right? If you're trying to log in as the admin user on a regular basis and you fat finger the password and you lock the account, P21 might break. All of a sudden, emails don't go out because it can't authenticate as administrator or admin anymore. And there's a little known but great feature of Active Directory where you can restrict the locations of those accounts. So you can say this service account can only be logged in from the SQL server and from my middleware server, and that's it. So we're not going to have somebody on the edge of your network trying to log in as an application pool or some service account. So there's great tools that we have here to tighten the screws. Of course, the only problem with security is as you tighten the screws, you run the risk of breaking something. So that's why you tighten the screws and test first, and then you roll over to your production environment once you know what the impact is going to be. All right, so our server security then, we've got next moving on to our infrastructure management. All right, infrastructures, how are all these things connected? They could be connected most likely through Ethernet. Your legacy client talking to the SQL server should probably be in Ethernet. It might be a WAN. And if it's a WAN, that's great, but there are latencies that are introduced in the WAN environment. They could be coming in over VPN. And while that's fully supported, VPNs, you typically don't want to run the P21 legacy client on that VPN endpoint, talking over the VPN all the way back to the SQL server, because that's going to introduce a latency. And unless it's a very forgiving and lightweight user, they're probably not going to be happy. And then there's road warriors, of course, where they're coming in probably over a VPN to be able to access the P21 environment. And we need to keep in mind here with road warriors, you might have users coming in over the public internet space and be able to access that over some protocol. Typically it's SSL. Keep in mind when you do an SSL certificate, which is now the way that we typically roll out the middleware server, SSL certs now have a maximum of a 1-year lifespan. Thank you very much, Google, for shortening it. We used to have 3-year certificates a couple of years ago. And now if you buy an SSL cert from a third-party CA, it's only a 1 year. So that means every year you're going back into your middleware server and you're swapping a certificate. Easy to do, but you got to remember it's there. Put a reminder on your calendar before the SSL expires, and everybody goes, wow, P21's down because of an expired SSL cert. Of course, your storage, whether that's direct attached storage or it's a SAN-based storage, how quickly that SQL server can get to the database is going to be key in your performance. And make sure that you look for those latencies in the connections, right? One of the things that we use in our hosted environment is the remote desktop protocol over UDP instead of TCP. Now, typically that's only used in the legacy client environment, but that's one way that you can help improve the performance. If you use the web or the hybrid client, it's naturally a thinner or lighter on the network client than the legacy client. So if you're using the web or the hybrid client, you probably aren't going to need RDP servers. You're probably going to be able to spread that the network out. Road warriors can probably use the web client, even over a VPN, without having to suffer the consequences of that legacy client and its high-speed connections needed to the SQL server. We've also found that there's a number of clients that use different types of connections to the SQL server. Even if you're in the web/hybrid client world, we have clients that connect up to the SQL server for ODBC connections, right? Excel spreadsheets, reporting tools, all these things, they go right to the P21 database. And don't forget about them, because while the web client is great, you know, if that Excel spreadsheet doesn't get updated data, users aren't going to be happy. And that typically is done through some network protocol. Again, there's a variety of different ways to do it. But in the typical world, that's going to be the client talking directly to the SQL server. Okay, moving on. Still no questions? That's great. I'm going to save a couple of minutes here at the end, and I know I am. A few more slides here to go. Okay, applications. I'm not going to dive into the details of SQL servers. If you're a SQL DBA, you probably know all of this. If you're not a SQL DBA, I would strongly recommend that you get your hands on one. So that they can take a look at, we have DBAs on staff here at EstesGroup, where you can say, hey, let's look at how the memory is allocated in your SQL server. What's the transaction log looks like? Are you doing backups properly? If you've never restored from your backup, then you probably don't have a backup. Sure, you might get the email every night that says the backup was done, but until you test it, ideally from the ground up, right? Not just the database, but the whole SQL server, the whole middleware server. Backups are a really important thing to test, and that's true of SQL as well as all of the different servers. I list off a couple of different websites here. These are folks that we use in our hosting environment to make sure that our SQL servers are running properly. Brent Ozar has a really great document. If you've Google out, not right now, I want you to pay attention to me, but when you get a spare time, Google 9 ways to lose your SQL data. And you'll find a blog article by Brent, which is a really scary article. It talks about 9 different ways that a well-meaning sysadmin, DB admin, can accidentally lose your SQL database. And believe it or not, in my tenure here as a DBA, I have seen all 9 ways and none of them are pretty. So please make sure that you have that moment. So therefore, index optimization is a big part, making sure that your P21 SQL indexes are optimized. I see P21 databases have been running for years. They just get slower and slower and slower. And that's because their indexes were never re-indexed. Easy fix. Ola Hollengren's written a great script to do that. And of course, monitoring it. One tool is Quest has a great SQL Spotlight tool. And there are others out there to just watch the SQL server and make sure it's not blowing up. With your IIS server, you want to make sure that if you're keeping your IIS logs, that's the historical logs. Typically in a web server world, we look at those logs to see who's visiting my website, where did they come from, and where are they clicking to. In the P21 space, those log files typically are not used. So either turn them off, or if you're using them, manage them, as in don't fill up your disk with a bunch of little log files. Very often I can go into a middleware server or an IIS server, and if they don't do log file management, I can see from day 1 that the server was stood up to today, 1 file per day, that the server's been alive. And that's great, except it fills up disk space. And if you're not using log, disable it. There are a couple of tools also that we keep in the application server, middleware server, to recycle the app pool. And this is actually included in one of these P21 tuning guides. I did include the KB articles. Some are a little old, I get that, but these KB articles we use when we install P21 to make sure it's optimized, so that we have the best experience for those users. And that has to do with IIS tuning, SQL tuning, and the application of the middleware tuning as well. Okay, so change management, a huge issue here. I want to make sure that you have a change management system, because if you don't have a change management system and you just are making, by the seat of your pants changes to the ERP system, then all of a sudden something breaks, or it gets slow, or it feels different, or something like that, and you go across the finger pointing exercise. Who did that? When did you do it? Why did you do that? What did it impact? And so making sure that you can identify those changes is going to be key, and the dates that those changes occurred. So when you create changes, or when you make a change, it creates both the intended effect. Our server's patched. We upgraded P21, right? Our antivirus tool is now doing a better job at being antivirus. But it also has unintended fallout, right? It's slower now. Now, maybe slower is because the new tool or the new feature you rolled out does indeed need more resources, and it's just slower because the nature of the beast. But on the other hand, it could be unintended, right? I didn't realize that we're now scanning the SQL databases for malware again. So be ready for those changes. It could be as simple as an Excel sheet. I personally love OneNote. OneNote is a great tool to do change management because you can screenshot the before and you can screenshot the after in one note, no pun intended. And that way, and it's all time-stamped, so that way you can track it down, you can find it. So OneNote is a great tool. There are change management systems. If you're a larger company, you've already got change management tools in place for things other than P21. Just make sure P21 falls in that change management infrastructure. Of course, you need to be able to test your changes. Whenever you make a change, ideally you do the whole quote to cache, A to Z testing to make sure that what you changed didn't break something. And that would be great if we just had unlimited time in the day to start doing testing. You might have dedicated testers in your environment, right? When you upgrade P21, you typically upgrade the test environment first. And then, as a server guy, after I do the upgrade, I bring up the P21 client and I log in and I get to the homepage and I go, I'm good, right? The upgrade worked. From an infrastructure standpoint, yes, right? If I can log in and the client was upgraded, perfect. But from a functional standpoint, does that new P21 version do what you need it to do? And we have a bunch of functional folks. Again, we're going to let Terri and Jim talk more about that aspect later. because the new versions of P21, especially when you jump from legacy to web client, it's a different animal. And so being able to test those changes, identify any issues. Oh yeah, we need to train the end users. I'm going to talk about training in this deck, but make sure that you can test that out. And that includes not just the P21 application, but all the ancillary tools that are around it. Because when you do that upgrade, first off, you got to have your patch management window, right? Tell all your users, the first Sunday of the month is patch day. Microsoft for the long time, right? It was the second Tuesday of the month was patch Tuesday. And they would create all sorts of problems on the following Wednesday because everybody would install Microsoft patches and then stuff would break. And if you don't test it first and you just do it direct in production, that might be a bad day. So you need a fallback plan. So be ready because those patches are coming. The Windows operating system gets updated. Even Server 19 has updates and patches. SQL gets updated. SQL 2019, they don't do service packs anymore for SQL. They just do cumulative updates. So much like the Windows cadence now, SQL just gets little patches every month or so. And they recommend you install them. But if you don't have enough bandwidth, you're just trying to get your day job done, installing all these patches might fall by the wayside. Of course, the Epicor application itself. We know several clients that are sitting there in an old version of P21 simply because they don't have the bandwidth to do the testing, or they found a bug and they don't have the fixes for those bugs just yet. Epicor is classic for saying, oh, we fixed that in the next version. So just upgrade again and we'll get that fixed up. Not to mention the third-party applications, your e-commerce connectivity, your ODBC drivers, your third-party reporting tools, all those things that are using the P21 infrastructure to do their job. And you do an update to P21 and it might be a surprise, the website broke. That would be bad. So when it looks to doing these changes, I'd like to identify some of the responsibilities that your IT folks have right now in managing your P21 space. So I kind of layered this out here in a couple of different ways because I wanted to bring to the table here. We've got from the very bottom of this chart all the way up to the top. We look at this from what IT layers are your IT folks responsible for. At the bottom level, we have our networking. That's the Ethernet and the VPN. If you have a SAN, that's your SAN uses a network also. Then we have our storage, which is your disks, how fast those disks spin, how many disks, are they RAID 1, RAID 5? We have on top of that, most of the time now we have some layer of virtualization. So we have a virtualization layer, Hyper-V or VMware. On top of that virtualization layer, we build servers, right? Here's a box, we're gonna call it SQL. It's gonna have 4 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, and that's a server. And on top of that server, we put an operating system. Might be Windows 16, Windows 19. I would recommend you don't install Windows 12 anymore, 2012 anymore, Server 2012, that's old. Even Server 2016 is getting a little long in the tooth. If you have the option, go Server 19 and future-proof yourself. On top of that operating system, you install middleware. That's going to be SQL, IIS, P21 middleware. On top of that, you plop data, right? You've got your P21 database. So your SQL DB admins need to know how to move data around. On top of that, you put an application, let's call it P21. And the way you roll out P21 is maybe you decide to roll out the web client for your users. Maybe you decide to roll out the legacy client for some set of folks because they're old school and they don't like change. And then you roll out the web client for all your new hires. And then ultimately, this thing called seats is where we take the application and you package it in such a way to where the user just consumes the data. They're not responsible for managing the application, or they're not responsible for changing how the application works, or adding new tax codes and adding new warehousing locations and things like that. Where you're managing kind of the application, the data layer. They're just users. They just need a seat, right? And so when we look at these different layers, as we roll across from your on-prem environment all the way through the cloud services, it's important to kind of note here that on-premise, you're managing it all. Now, EstesGroup as a managed service provider can certainly help, but as we move into the cloud environment, you might choose to be infrastructure as a service. That is, I want to have all of the machines and the virtualization and all that networking stuff just taken care of for me. Azure and Amazon Web Services is a classic solution for that. Then there's platform as a service, where more and more of that functionality all the way up to that through the application layer is taken care of by the cloud provider. Okay, and all you need to do is manage how are you going to roll this out to your user? What protocols do you choose? And then if you go all the way to software as a service, this is where basically you go, I need a P21 solution, please, and just give it to me in a web browser. I'm done. And so that becomes a very sanitized version of P21 where you don't have a lot of flexibility, but you get a lot of scalability. Every one of you has probably been approached by Epicor by now that says, hey, we have P21 SaaS as a service, software as a service, and that's the P21 SaaS environment. And if you fit in that, great. But there's a lot of clients that don't have the, they can't fit in that box for any number of reasons. And so that's when they'd start looking at private cloud environments or hybrid cloud environments like EstesGroup can provide, where we can give you the flexibility without forcing you into a small box. Okay, next slide here was just talking about those application layers. I've already described all of this to you already, so I'm not going to read the slide. Whether you're delivering the application in a fixed format, whether you get to deliver the application and say, hey, you get to pick the web client or the hybrid client or the legacy client, your SQL database manager, right? You need to be able to copy live to play, usually on a regular basis, we do that. You might also have to move your SQL data in and out of the database, e-commerce application, for example. Managing the middleware servers, right? Whether it's SQL, it's IIS, or it's the P21 application on top of those. That's a lot of middleware. You have to manage the Windows operating system, right? P21 is a Windows OS solution. The clients can be Mac. Clients can be Linux machines with the browser. The servers themselves, you've got to allocate the right amount of CPU and resources. The virtualization layer can be a huge bottleneck if you're not careful. The storage, likewise, if you don't have fast enough storage, everything suffers, especially to that SQL server. And then the networking aspect, right? You need to get all the networking geeks together to make sure that they're all connected, not only that they're talking, but they're talking securely, because that's where the bad guys break in. Okay, we have a number of different hosting options. You can take your ERP system and put it on an on-premise server, right? You're probably coming from that environment now where you bought a SQL server and maybe some terminal servers and you installed the P21 client. That's great. You can still do that. They can be physical or virtual, and it's a capital expense. You're buying a server. When you buy a server, you're going to expect to depreciate that over 5 years, roughly. And so you're going to overbuy that server. You're going to buy a bigger box than you need right today because you've got to plan for future growth. Then you can put it up in the public cloud. That's another place where you can rent the resource from an Amazon or Azure infrastructure as a service in that previous slide. And it turns into a monthly rental, but there's pros and cons. We'll talk about that in the next feature. You can, of course, go with Epicor, right, and get Epicor SaaS for P21, and that's great, and it turns into an operational expense where you manage very little. You just get seats. Then you can also go with a private managed cloud environment like our Estes Cloud Managed Hosting, which no surprise I'm a big fan of. And this is where basically we can put you in a shared tenant to save some costs. We can put you in a dedicated tenant if you are, if you sell to the government. You're DFARS, ITAR, CMMC compliant, and that would be a dedicated tenant because they don't play well with others. Again, it does turn into an operational expense. The nice thing about our Echo environment is that we can scale up and down fairly easily. So if your Christmas rush means that you need some more CPUs and some more servers to handle the crunch of Christmas, great, we can spin it up over the Christmas holiday. And then in January, when it settles back down, we can take out CPUs, we can take out memory, save yourself a couple of bucks. So on premise, of course, you've got to buy the servers and maintain them and support them and replace all the hard drives when they die, because hard drives still die. You need to make sure that you don't lose a system because 2 hard drives died in a RAID system. If you host it in the public cloud, you are completely dependent upon the vendor response. I don't know if any of you had to call Amazon or Microsoft lately because of an issue. That might not be the greatest experience, especially when your ERP system is down. You want to be able to pick up the phone and yell at somebody. So putting the public cloud, they kind of remove that phone call ability. Microsoft doesn't let you call them anymore. You can still open a ticket and somebody will get back to you, but it's not the same warm fuzzy as picking up the phone and going, fix it. SaaS, of course, is great when you want free and forced upgrades. That's helpful to some users where they don't have a complex environment and it's okay to get an upgrade. And then 2 weeks later, you upgrade your production environment. But SaaS forces you to get that update. Understandably, Epicor's got to keep their code base current. They don't want to keep, supporting your legacy environment from 3 years ago because you just never updated. But y'all have heard from your Epicor cam already on why you haven't updated, right? Or been asked why. And then, of course, in the private cloud environment where we can maintain the servers and the application and the infrastructure and the databases and all that stuff, and give you flexibility as to how you're going to connect things, what add-ons you want to put into that P21 environment, what your upgrade and update schedule needs to be, right? You can say, let's update the test environment this weekend, give us a month to test it, and then we'll put it into production. And then, of course, the disaster recovery and the backups, we make sure that your server is being backed up and that we can restore it in the appropriate RPO and RTOs that you need. So lots of benefits here. And I would encourage you to take a look at each of these different places that you can put your ERP system. We'd be happy to share with you any more details about our Echo environment. But I didn't want to pitch that too much because I'm out of my time. So I want to make sure that I opened the slide up for any questions and the presentation up for any questions. Again, if you have any more, I will be available after the presenters at our little roundtable discussion a couple hours from now. But for that, I do appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, I'm watching this screen over here to see what they might be. And with that, I say thank you very much for your time. I look forward to answering questions.
And Daryl,
with that, Cindy, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Awesome, thank you. I have a couple of questions for you that came into me, if you would be so kind as to answer them.
Absolutely.
And you might have answered this during, but I'm not super technical, so just tell me to pass if so. Do
Absolutely.
I need to be on the latest version of P21 to use the hybrid or web client?
So do you have to be on the latest version of P21 to use the web or hybrid client? The answer is no, but Epicor prefers that you are, right? We have seen market improvements, not only in feature sets, but in performance and I want to say bug fixes to the later versions. So if you're running the hybrid client or the web client and it's not exactly what you expected, my recommendation would be to update to the latest version and see if that fixes your problem. But actually the web client's been out for 3 or 4 years now. So it's not a new product. Okay.
All right, another one. Okay, 2 came in. So for customers familiar with E10 but new to Prophet 21, are there any issues you should watch out for at the database level? Any significant database differences between Prophet 21 and E10?
So in terms of the database structure, yes, there are absolute differences. The ERP10 product uses a database and a lot of ancillary databases, where P21 primarily has one database per application. So P21 is a little simpler of an environment and doesn't have as many interactions between databases as E10 does. But the concepts and management, what I've discussed here, really is applicable to almost any ERP system. You still need to monitor your servers and make sure that they're properly tuned, not over or under committed in memory. So the answer to that, I'd have to say no, there's not any issues that I would look out for. There's just different facets to the application and how they operate. So hopefully that answers the question.
Please review, if you could, what the VMX Net3 driver is for.
Awesome. Right. So the VMX Net3 driver is a VMware specific network card driver. A lot of clients, when they install a new virtual server in the VMware world, they install the Windows operating system, and the Windows operating system goes, well, how much CPU, memory, disk, and network do I have? And can I auto detect my drivers? And so the client will, the server will install with what's called an emulated driver. It's typically an Intel E1000 NIC, which works. Don't get me wrong. And if it works, then the engineer typically goes, hey, great, I got an IP address, I'm good. And they move forward. But they forget to install the VMware tools, which is a little helper application, very, very important in the VMware environment. Microsoft started building this in the Hyper-V environment many years ago. So Hyper-V folks don't see this issue. But in the VMware environment, if you don't take that Intel E1000 NIC and remove it and install the native VMware VMX Net3 NIC, you're missing out on network performance. And if that network performance happens to be on your SQL server to the middleware server, both of those should have VMX Net3 drivers to be able to talk really fast. Otherwise, they go down to a emulated Intel E1000 NIC, and it works, it's just not optimal. And I see that very frequently. All right, anything else?
I believe that that covers it, and we're out of time. I had a few more come in, but I'm going to pocket those for the roundtable. So if that's okay, I'd like if we could share the results of the poll. I don't believe those were shared the first time. If somebody could pull that up, please.
How's this?
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, just so we have that, I know someone requested at the end that we discuss that. So how have you deployed Prophet 21 at your organization? 30% of you web client, 40% hybrid, 50% legacy fat client. So there you have it. Thank you again, Daryl.
My pleasure. Right. Thanks so much.
Let me go ahead and share my screen again. All right, the bird is the word. So now we're going to take a quick break, and then we will come back and we'll take a poll. And per the request of the attendee, we'll share that at the end of the session this time. So we'll see you back here in about 3 minutes. I'll give you guys 4 though. Thanks. Okay, it is noon o'clock where I am, so welcome back. Some of you still might be coming back in, but I'm going to launch the new poll, and then I will introduce our speaker in a few minutes. All right, and we'll go ahead and finish answering that, and we'll introduce our next speaker. All right, so for our second presentation, we have Terri Gage. She'll be providing a presentation on the creation of Prophet 21 financial statements using P21's Financial Line Express. She's a senior Prophet 21 consultant here at EstesGroup and a longtime project manager, implementation consultant, and Prophet 21 specialist. So please help me turn it over to Terri.
Hello, everyone. I should say good afternoon. We're right on the dot of morning and afternoon. So the first thing I'm going to do is go through the slides presentation because I would rather have you understand the logic between creating the financial statements and Excel. And then at the end of these slides, we'll go into the actual application. So I am going to start the slide presentation. One important note, I've had several clients mention to me that with the web version, they can't do financials anymore. And I think where that confusion has come from is if you have your financials set up with financial line item maintenance, those need to be converted to the Financial Line Express setup. So that's what we're going to focus on, is creating the financial statements in the Financial Line Express setup. And we're actually going to go through the order that you will do when you're in the database. The first thing that you will do is create the Excel template. What Prophet 21 does is it actually takes the data from Prophet 21 and does it onto the Excel template. So you will map it, you will tell it what data to put in what row on the Excel template, And that we do in the financial line express setup is where we tell the system how to map it. The financial statement maintenance is the same thing you did for your prior version for the in the financial line item maintenance. I'm sorry, all these window names are very similar. It's the same thing. There's only one difference, and I will show you what that difference is. The financial line express setup is actually where you do most of your work. That's where you're going to map all your GL accounts to where the data is going to total, where it's going to be merged together and put on your worksheet. And the generating financial statements is a simple click of a button, and you're also doing that in the same window is where you set them up. Your Excel workbook, it must be in Excel 2007 and later. So if you have a worksheet that's Excel 2003, all you have to do is open it up and save it as whatever version Excel is running on your server. But it has to be later than 2007. In the desktop version, when you're doing your financial setup, the columns are numeric. So if in your Excel worksheet, if it's column A, you're using 1. If it's column B, you're using 2. In the web version, you're actually using the alpha. So it would be the exact same as what's in the Excel workbook. And I already mentioned the Prophet 21 dropping the data into the column and row that you've told P21 where to put it. So here's the desktop version. I have the next screenshot will be the web version. So the report type is the only difference of how your financial report would be set up now if you set them up using the financial line item maintenance. The financial report ID is system assigned, so you have to leave that blank and the system will assign it. The financial report description will be the name of your report. The statement type, there's a drop-down box, and your choices are balance sheet, profit and loss, or other. The reason to select the appropriate one, it ties to your general ledger chart of accounts if you flag them as a balance sheet account or a revenue or an expense account. The application, you select the Excel version that you are using. So in my case, I have Excel 2016 that I created the financial statement templates in. So I chose Excel 2016. And then you have to browse to your file path. Because I am working in a demo database remotely, I have it on my C drive on my laptop. More than likely, yours is going to be in a shared folder that your company uses to store your files. On the detail portion, the lower portion of your screen is where you're going to create your time periods, which will correspond with how your Excel spreadsheet is set up. So in this example for a balance sheet, current time period 1 is the current year and current period. So if I want to generate June 2021, it is this year, the period I enter, which would be the current period. It doesn't have to be. You could put in April and generate them for April. My second one is to have a column with prior year, because I only want to go 1 year back, so minus 1 year. And then my period is the same. I want to show June for last year. Or if when I generate the financial statement, if I put in April, I want April for last year. Just as a high level example, I did a financial statement for a client that they actually wanted to list every period in one worksheet. So we had time periods 1 through 12, and each period would be an increasing negative amount. So we had -1, -2, -3, all the way up to 12. And here's your web version. The screen looks slightly different. However, the data is all the same. You just have to get used to the visual appearance of it. I just put in a few examples of different time periods, just to make it easier to understand what you are doing with the time periods. So the financial line express setup, as I mentioned, that's where you're going to do your work. The column maintenance tab brings in the data from the financial statement maintenance record that you created. So it will have a drop down with the time periods. Only the time periods that you created in the financial statement maintenance record will appear here. Those are the only ones you can choose. If you get into this window and you decide you need another time period, you can go back to the financial statement maintenance record and edit it. You can add to it at any point. And I had already mentioned for the spreadsheet column, if you are in the web version, it's alpha. If you are in the desktop version, it's numeric. The account type is where you select what type of data you want to put on the report. So my example is the balance sheet. If you can visualize, we have column C with the current year, column D with the prior year. Well, because it's a balance sheet, I want cumulative data. So my account type is cumulative for both. If I were doing a profit and loss statement, I may want my first column to be the period data and my second column to be the year-to-date data, in which case then I would have period balance on my first row and cumulative on my second. You can also do quarters if your quarters are set up in fiscal year maintenance. So the row maintenance tab, just one second, I am going to put on a pointer. The row maintenance tab, here are your tabs. The row maintenance tab is just visual, and it will also bring whatever you type in here over into your account maintenance tab when you're actually linking your accounts in P21. You will want these row numbers to match your Excel worksheet. So on my Excel template, on row 6, I have cash and equipment. You do not have to enter the data exactly like it is on your Excel worksheet. I generally do copy and paste, so mine will match exactly instead of actually typing the data in. The reverse sign. This is to take your credits and have them print as a debit. Generally, when you're submitting a financial statement to your board of directors, to an outside source, for your assets, for your liabilities and owner's equity, you're not showing a negative amount. It's printing on the report as a positive amount. And that's what the reverse sign is. So you, for any asset and liability account, you'll want to check your reverse sign. Also for sales in the profit and loss statement, you would want to check your reverse sign. Oh, sorry, I need to go back. To make it easy to set this up and map these, what I normally do is I will print my worksheet and I make sure in Excel, it's the slide's awful small if you can see it. On page setup, I check row and column headings. So I want to print the column headings and the row numbers, and then it makes it easier to map when you're in P21 on your row maintenance tab. On your account maintenance tab is where you're actually going to link the accounts to the row that you want it to accumulate with and print on your financial statement. So for an example, if you're posting your sales by product group, you may have 10 sales accounts, but on your financial statement, you want to list one number for sales. All 10 accounts will actually list in this area. When you get at the bottom of the window on your account maintenance tab, you have a couple options down here. The show branches will allow you to select accounts for specific branches. For example, if you are doing a P&L statement by branch, then you will want to have just the accounts for a specific branch. If you are doing a consolidated statement and you have the show branches unchecked, when you select the account, the system will automatically add all branches. Show assigned accounts will show you accounts that are already linked. If that is not checked, when you try to add an account, when you click the add from the right click option menu, when you click add and you get your search window, it will only show you accounts that have not previously been linked, which comes in really handy. After you link all your accounts, you're actually ready to generate your report. On the OLE criteria tab is where you enter the period and year for the report that you want to generate. Now, this is done every time you want to generate a report. P21 does not save this criteria when you finish generating the reports. And this is the period and year that you enter is your base period and year. So when we talked about setting up the time periods, and I had one for the current year and current period, I hit all zeros in my parameter boxes. And then my second time period was prior year. So in this case, because I'm saying December 2020, the data that will be retrieved in my current year time box is December 2020. My second time period that I said was last year, a -1, will be December 2019. On the Olay Company tab and the Olay Branches tab, B21 gives you the option to include or exclude companies and branches. More than likely, you would only be running it for one company at a time, or the branches I generally take care of in the mapping. However, you can choose to do one or more branches. Again, this is not saved. It does default to select all companies, but it is your entry is not saved. You enter it every time you want to generate a report. This is optional. You'll see an icon that says load spreadsheet. What that does is it loads your blank template. You do not need to load the spreadsheet to generate your financial reports. Once you've entered your criteria, you decide which period and year you're going to run the report for. All you do is click Olay Spreadsheet, which is this icon here. And P21 will populate the numbers for you. Once your spreadsheet has been generated, you can export it to Excel. In the desktop version, there's a little green X that looks like familiar with your Excel normal icons. In the web version, it's this arrow, drop-down arrow to export it. When you click on it, you get your pop-up boxes on what type of file you want to save it as. Normally, it's going to be XLSX, your normal Excel workbook, and then you will choose your path. Okay, well, we're not at the question and answer section yet. So now we're going to the desktop, and that will make more sense to you. First, I'll bring up my Excel spreadsheet. So column C is the current year to date. Column D is the prior year to date. Again, we're doing a balance sheet example. I've created my balance sheet template and I've saved it preferably in a shared drive folder. Here is our financial statement maintenance window. So let's call this. We call it a demo balance sheet. Here's the statement type, your drop-down box where you want to select what type of financial statement it is. We'll go with balance sheet. Report type. It has to be the Financial Line Express setup if you're using it in the web version. application, I am going to select Excel 2016 because that's what I saved my template in. And browse to your path. It's going to bring me to the path where I selected last time, which makes it nice. And because I've already had that template linked to another report, I'm just getting this little warning, but it's okay because I can use it in the same template for several reports. Time period. From the Excel spreadsheet, I have my 2 columns, so I have my 2 time periods this year and last year. So my first time period is this year. There is no base year offset. Whatever I enter on the criteria tab is the year I want. The same with the quarter and the same with the period. Now my second time period is last year. So it's minus 1 year from this year. I'm not using any quarters, and I want the same period last year as this year. So I have a 0 in there also. And that's it. If you were doing, as I mentioned, a profit and loss where your first column is your period, your second column is year to date, third column is the same period prior year, and the fourth column is year to date prior year, I would have 4 time periods because I would have a minus, I'm sorry, I just said that wrong. I'm a screen ahead. You would only need your same 2 time periods. I'm going to save this. And I get a little note up here instead of the pop-up box that's in the desktop version that the file was actually saved. Oops. So now we come to the Financial Line Express setup window. And I'm going to retrieve the statement I just created, which was demo database balance sheet. My template has in column C, yes, in column C is my cumulative balance for this year. Zoom is not liking my mouse. Might make me, it's making me select it instead of typing it. It's my cumulative balance for this year, so I do not need to enter anything in my base year, base quarter, or base period. I apologize, my not recognizing my entering. Go with add. should be able to enter just like in all the other windows in P21. You should be able to enter a tab to get a new row. But it looks like I'm having an issue with my keyboard. And again, I'm doing cumulative balance, but this time it's time period 2 because I want last year. And this will self-populate. I like to enter through and add a lot of rows before I start pasting in data. Just my own personal preference. Then I generally try to have my Excel worksheet, unless I have a printed copy in front of me, have my Excel worksheet up so I can just copy and paste. You have to do Control V and then just go down the report. I'm not going to take the time to do a lot of them. So right now we only have on row 6, cash and equivalent. I click on my account tab, I will see row 6 is cash and equivalent. You can paste an account number, you can manually type it in, or you can double click and drill down and select it. In this case, I want all of these cash accounts to appear on that row. So I am checking all 4 of them. If I flag the show branches, I will see each branch for each account. If I wanted to, I could select only branch 100. I'm going to select all of them. The show assigned accounts, we won't see anything right now because I haven't assigned any yet. So I'm going to click OK. And now these accounts are assigned. A month from now, I create a new cash account. I need to add it to the financial statement. I would go on any row under the cash and equivalents, and I'm going to right click and add. And I get a blank row. Doesn't matter where you put it. When you save it, the report's going to show a numerical order, account number numerical order anyway. So I'm going to go in and select another account, the new one. Let's say I just created petty cash and I want to put that in. So I can add petty cash. Same thing if you want to delete an account. I decided I just don't want this account for all branches. So I can click delete all branches and it's gone. I also recommend saving frequently. If I save it now, I can go pull it back up and finish it. You don't want to go in and lose all your work if you've typed in 40 rows in the row maintenance and you've linked 80 accounts. So I would stop and save it along the way. Once you've mapped all your accounts, you can go to your OLE criteria tab. Again, I'm going to put in December 2020. And I click the OLE icon. Because I only mapped the accounts for this row, that's the only data we're going to see. Except for this 2020, which is actually on the spreadsheet. I'm thinking I should probably stop and ask if there's any questions at this point. Instead of waiting till the Q&A.
We have not gotten any questions come in yet.
Is there any areas that any of the participants would like to go over again? It's an awful lot. No? Okay. Let's take a look at I am going to pull up, oops, profit and loss because it has more columns on it. So here's our Excel template for a profit and loss statement, income statement. We have column B for the current period, column D, current year to date, column F, current period of the prior year, and H, prior year to date. I'm going to clear this one. And we'll go back to this is going to be a new report type, financial line express setup, and the type is profit and loss statement. You can have your Excel worksheet up or you can have it printed out. So the time period, again, 1 is a current year. And 2 will be the prior year. For column maintenance, our first column we're going to put data in is column B. And it is a period balance. And it is this year. The next column we're going to put data in is column D. And it's a cumulative balance. for this year. And then column. These are the built-in financial statements that come with Profit 21, so I don't have the column memorized. So column F is the period balance for last year. Let me check. Time period 2. And our last column H is cumulative balance for last year. That's it. This is, oops. Yeah. This is usually the difficult tab that clients take a little bit of time to get used to, and that's why I went over it so many times. And I'm going to save this because we're not actually going to go through and do the whole maintenance, row maintenance and account maintenance setup now. But we can bring up the pre-existing one that is already mapped. So it's the same template. It just has all of the rows already mapped. And I will Olay spreadsheet. Oops. I skipped my Olay criteria tab. Again, I'm going to do period 12, 2020. And now I will Olay. So we have the data for December 2020 and December 2019, the prior year. Export it and save it. No, I don't want to open. The worst thing about exporting these statements is you can't put a date on it. The system doesn't populate a date. And so you have to open your Excel spreadsheet and label it December 2020, December 2019, and then save it again. Now we can go to the official question and answer session.
Okay, I have a question that came in that they said they might have missed this. It might have already been covered. Can you export financial statements to PDF format?
You can when you have your save as type. However, it's going to be missing the dates.
Okay, we'll leave a few more moments for questions to come in. All right, another one. How long did it take you to learn how to use P21 general ledger functionality?
That's a good question. I think we need more details. Personally, not long, because applications I used prior to P21 were very similar. If you're not familiar with a lot of the functions in P21, so possibly you're new to the accounting area, or you've been using a very limited application, I would say maybe in 8 hours of training and you should be good to go. At the most, at the most. Now, if you mean just the financial, creating the financial statements, there again, if you had in-person training opposed to, you know, a demonstration through a webinar, I'd say maybe 2 hours.
All right, and another one, Excel Connect works with E10. Does it work with P21 as well?
Yes, it is. It's a little bit limited because of the pre-built-in fields that you can choose depending on what you're using it for. I have lots of clients who use it. I have other clients who use it, and then also do have some custom reports, but people are very happy with it.
All right, and another one, are there any limitations that you need to consider in your GL chart setup, things that will make it difficult to report against?
Yes. So if this is a new implementation, I would put some time in considering your account mask. So every business is unique. If you have branches, if you have departments, you need to look at how you want your mask set up, because you can wildcard in the financial statements. You can wildcard in any GL drill down when you're doing inquiries. So yes, definitely. And officially, you cannot change your account mask once you go live. Unofficially, it has been done. I'm sure that the script to do it is stored with support. You would have to engage them. It's an additional fee. It's not normal support, but it can be done.
All right, awesome. It looks like that's all of the questions that have come in. I'll give us about another 30 seconds to a minute if anyone has any questions that they're still maybe trying to type down. And then if not, we'll take a little bit of a longer break and meet back here at about 12:58 Eastern and take a poll a few minutes beforehand. But I do know that we also need to see the results from the last poll now that I'm mentioning that. If someone could share that, that might be a good thing to end on today. Awesome. So what reporting option do you use in your P21 installation? The majority is 43% crystal reports, P21 standard reports at 29%, SSRS 14, and extract to Excel 14. Thank you much. And no other questions have come in. So with that, I will go ahead and give you guys a little bit longer of a break, and we will see you back here at 12:58 Eastern. And someone asked what the next session was going to be. It's going to be with Jim Fry doing it. Excuse me. He will be discussing the bridging of the gap between Epicor and suppliers for distribution companies. So there you have it. All right, as we're all coming back in, I just launched the third poll. What third-party solutions are you pursuing to optimize your P21 installation? And we'll share those at the end of the next session. Okay, welcome back. Oh, oopsie daisy. Here we go. Sorry about that. All right. So next we have Jim Fry. He will be presenting our final presentation of the day. He's the Enterprise Sales Director at SourceDay. He's a longtime Epicor expert and leverages over 30 years of experience working with global manufacturing and distribution companies of all sizes. He will be discussing the bridging of the gap between Epicor and suppliers for distribution companies. With that, I will turn it over to John, or Jim. Sorry about that.
That is all right. See if I can share my screen here. All right, well, good afternoon, folks. Let me just move some of the screens out of the way here. For those of you unfamiliar, my name is Jim Fry, Enterprise Sales Director here at SourceDay. And if you don't recognize me from my headshot, it's because I'm wearing my hair a little differently these days, post-COVID. I guess based upon that introduction and the title of Enterprise Sales Director at SourceDay, I feel like I should explain some of my background at a very high level, just to kind of give you a sense of who I am and how I've earned a seat at the table here for discussion with you, which I do very much appreciate. I've been with SourceDay about a year now. Prior to that, I worked 22 years as a product expert, the last 15 of which with Epicor for, 1995 through last year. Prior to that, I worked 7 years in the same capacity for a smaller ERP system based out of Indianapolis, made to manage systems. And then prior to that, I worked 12 years as a project manager and estimator for a titanium fabrication and distribution company in Fairfield, New Jersey. So 35 years all in for manufacturing, distribution, and ERP. Very much appreciate your participation today. I've been asked to participate from the perspective of supply chain. And I guess just as a brief comment here, one of the reasons my career has kind of migrated to where I'm at now now, having spent my entire career, 34 years in manufacturing, distribution, and ERP, is that there have been some very common themes across all of the customers with whom I've worked over the years, of which there are well over 1,000 during my career. And my specialty has always been in the operational efficiency, trying to optimize supply chain and planning, scheduling, organizations, things like that. And so one common request that I was always asked to field is, how do we improve our supplier relationship management capabilities? How do we include our stakeholders in the supply chain to help us become more successful? And so over the last 2 years, I guess at the onset of COVID, I decided to go from a generalist to someone that is going to focus acutely in the supply chain area. So instead of going end to end for manufacturing and distribution organizations, I decided to focus on a very small swath within that group. And so here I am at Source Day, very happy to be here and appreciate your participation today. Our intent during today's session is to share with you a couple of high-level comments here in terms of the agenda, one of which is going to be the business challenges that Source Day solves, right? It's important to understand why we're in business, right? What business challenges can Source Day help you with as a P21 customer? So with that, we'll move into some customer testimonials because obviously it's important that we prove that we are solving those business challenges, not because we say so, but because our customers can testify to the benefits that we provide to them. Then we'll talk about the how, right? Some of the product highlights. How do we solve those problems? Some of the key areas of our platform that will enable us to make you successful in the supply chain area and improve some of those operational performance challenges that you're faced with today in the area of supply chain. We'll talk a little bit about the evaluation success plan, because one of the things in my experience that a lot of companies struggle with is, well, okay, this all looks great. I can see how there may be an improvement in our supply chain collaboration, but how do I get there? Well, how do I know what good looks like, right? So we've developed an evaluation success plan to help benchmark some of those details so that you have a starting point for comparison. And then across our existing customer base, we capture metrics that we're able to share with you today to help you understand some of the improvements that we're able to provide for other Source Day customers. And then lastly, of course, general questions and answers. So without further ado, I will go ahead and jump right into my presentation. And in keeping with that theme of what business challenges do we solve, one of the most common requirements for every product company in the world is that you need to meet your customer demand, right? Every customer, every company, global or domestic, large or small, has that same common requirement. And so that's a given. However, you're always faced with challenges. And when we talk about supply chain specifically, over the last 18 to 24 months, as COVID and other macroeconomic trends have set in globally, supply chain disruption is more rampant now than it ever has been in our nation's history, right? So you look at any newspaper article, web review, everywhere you turn, there's supply chain disruption, and no company is impervious to that, right? As you can see here, Ford suffered a plant fire, which caused some shutdown and prevented them from shipping product, which obviously resulted in some dissatisfied customers. Chick-fil-A, the chicken folks, right? They ran out of chicken. When you're talking about a company that whose sole purpose is to supply chicken, and in that fast food world, when you're out of product, it's hard to satisfy your customer base, right? So they had to issue an apology associated with their supply chain shortages. And the examples continue, right? Pepperidge Farms, they had an issue around the holidays where they couldn't supply all of the cookies that they needed to for holiday festivities. Glossier, another Source Day customer, had to issue a public apology to their customers as a result of not being able to fulfill demand. We're all familiar with the PlayStation woes, right? They've gone through numerous challenges over the years with different launches of their PlayStation models. And initially flying off the shelves, not being able to resupply, took a turn to the black market in many cases, right? Folks were buying bootleg systems at one point. And then of course, Peloton, this is probably the biggest and most recent example of supply chain disruption. They recently spent over $100 million to fix some of the supply chain challenges that they've had. We've probably all seen the stories about the ships waiting in the harbor in California with the Peloton equipment that they just couldn't bring into the port. And so those stories are endless. And again, you're not impervious to that if you have a large company. In fact, I would argue that as a smaller organization, you have more risk, right? Because those larger companies are getting supply of products more readily than smaller companies may. And so last but not least, tiny parts. This one is another example of factories not being able to produce product as a result of raw material shortages. And so the key takeaway to this slide is simply that no matter what organization you work with, no matter what industry you're in, you're going to have supply chain challenges. And if the suppliers are unable to produce product, there's not much anyone can do to fix that. However, what we've found at Source Day is that that's not the only challenge or impediment to being able to satisfy your customer orders. As distribution companies running P21, your primary goal is to deliver on time and in full. At 100% rate would be the target, right? And yet it's challenging to be able to do that when 50% of purchase orders to your suppliers are going to change over the lifespan of those POs. And so this is born out of our existing customer base. We look back over the last couple of years and we've seen a little bit of a spike during the COVID disruption. But of course, a lot of folks were cutting fewer purchase orders over that time. But when you look at the fact that more than 50% of those purchase orders are subject to change in terms of price, quantity, delivery over their lifespan, and then you look at the tools that most organizations use to manage that, things like phone communication, emails, spreadsheets, right? You'll capture a summary of spreadsheet information for a supplier, send your open order report to that supplier for an update, and then update your P21 system. And so what you're seeing here are all of the things that you're doing manually below the line to make sure that you have purchase order acknowledgments. You're communicating changes to your suppliers. They're acknowledging those changes. And then, of course, if they have changes of their own to suggest in terms of price, delivery, or quantity, you have to update your P21 system accordingly. And so there's a vicious cycle here. So 52% of those purchase orders are going to change over their life cycle, and you're using manual tools to manage that. You're really not optimizing your P21 solution. And so Source Day is really a tool that helps you manage that collaboration between your buyers and your suppliers. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But let's consider the fact that in addition to 50% of the orders that are going to change, you probably have a less than 100% fulfillment rate to your customers today. Right? So if your purchase orders are changing and you're not able to maintain that communication with your suppliers, and then your suppliers are making changes that are going to impact delivery of your products, what we found is that the typical P21 customer has an on-time supplier delivery, OTD, on-time delivery performance from their suppliers of anywhere from 65 to 80% on average. And so the bottom line is you need every single part to either assemble or to distribute out to your customers, right? But if you're looking at those on-time delivery rates that I mentioned a moment ago, on average, a third of those parts aren't going to arrive on time. So you are 100% guaranteed that those parts are potentially going to be late if a third of those don't arrive from the supplier on time. Very few distribution companies build in excessive lead times for their raw material. What they may do instead, of course, is adjust the safety stock so that you have additional products on the shelf and on the distribution floor to be able to satisfy that demand. The challenge is those third of your parts that aren't going to arrive on time tend to move around. It's not always the same 1/3. And so the business risk there, of course, is that you're tying up working capital to be able to satisfy those customer demands because you're building up your safety stock, right? So you're throwing money at the problem is the bottom line. And so there is a domino effect that continues to work through your organization. So if you have potentially late deliveries from your supplier, then you're going to be late in shipment to your customer. You're going to be late in invoicing, and late in recognizing revenue. And so that revenue, even though you can argue it's not a dollar for dollar, you have revenue targets like every other organization, right? Those revenue targets are done typically monthly, quarterly, and annually. And so if you can't ship an invoice, you can't recognize the revenue. So there is a potential downstream effect that supplier delay in shipment is going to have on your organization. And so as we continue the domino effect here, you look at the fact that in addition to not being able to recognize the revenue, there are potential costs associated with those late orders from your suppliers. There is, and we can argue what that number is. It tends to be a little bit smaller for distribution companies, a little bit larger for manufacturing companies, but there is a cost associated with a late PO. When you consider the fact that in many cases you may have expedited fees to your supplier to bring product in to ship on time in full. There could be customer penalties that you are assessed as a result of not being able to satisfy a customer, not to mention, of course, the lost opportunity cost, right? If you're unable to fulfill customer demand, they may take their business elsewhere, right? So we need to account for that as well. Downtime associated with the warehousing and packaging of goods typically results in some overtime and in most cases excess inventory because we're looking to stock up as a result of not knowing which products are going to be late and why, right? And so the cost of a late part, again, has a negative impact on your organization. Continuing that process, I've talked about the revenue risk of being a third of that, but what's the downstream effect of that? If a third of those parts are going to be late and we're potentially impacting our revenue, it's not uncommon for those purchase orders that are late to have some challenge associated with price, quantity, and delivery. Right. So the downstream effect of that is you've got AP invoice mismatches. And so if 50% of those orders are going to change, meaning that the price, delivery, or quantity has changed on that purchase order, and we're not maintaining the accuracy of those purchase orders as a result of the change, you're going to have supplier mismatches, which causes additional cost in your organization. So now you've got to do more manual three-way matches on the AP side to account for that. So the end result of that, of course, is additional disruption, right? So you're eroding some of the trust that your customers have put in you, your peers, your leadership team, and all around there is really a negative consequence to the organization, recognizing that late delivery from your supplier has a linear effect on your ability to deliver on time and in full to your customers. The reason for that is pretty obvious. Most ERP systems today, and Epicor P21 is no exception to this, are tremendous at managing the four walls of your organization and the stakeholders that are constituents within your business, right? Your end-to-end team from the standpoint of initial quoting and order entry through shipment, invoicing, and recognizing revenue. That process flow is generally handled within P21. However, your supplier network, which I would argue is a very important stakeholder in your success, are typically outside of the ERP system. Now, many P21 customers also have some EDI relationships with their suppliers. So you have automatic transactions for your 810s, your 820s, 830s, 856s, 862s, et cetera, all of those X12 type of transactions that occur in a distribution EDI environment. However, I would argue that even those companies that do have EDI reserve that for only the top echelon of their supplier base, right? There's a handful or maybe a dozen at most of those suppliers for a couple of reasons. One, it's challenging to set up, right? It's not an easy process to set up EDI. It costs money for your suppliers. They need to invest in that relationship with you. And then, of course, the mapping and the ongoing care and feeding of that transactional setup becomes cumbersome. And so while it's a very, in many organizations, it's a lights out type of transaction where there's a purchase order and a sales order that's generated between the two organizations, again, it's only a very small percentage of your suppliers. And so what SourceDay is in business to provide is that network capability between your ERP, P21, and your supplier network. So we sit between your buyers and your suppliers to collaborate all changes between the two organizations, and we do so in real time. So there's a common view of information to maintain transparency, which ultimately results in higher accuracy. And then, of course, the velocity is just incredible compared to what you're currently doing, which is probably cutting a PO, sending that purchase order via email to your supplier, calling in for an update to ensure that they got the PO and have acknowledged that purchase order. And then, God forbid, there's a change to the PO, which I've already identified happens more than 50% of the time for most organizations. Then you have to go through that cycle every time there's a change to price, quantity, and delivery. And so SourceDay sits between your P21 system and your supplier network to provide that level of visibility, transparency, and ultimately it fosters better relationships as well. And so now that we've kind of outlined the business challenge that we solve, let's talk very high level in terms of the footprint, how this fits within your ecosystem today. From a technical perspective, SourceDay is a multi-tenant SaaS solution. And so it's subscriptions based. It does not require hardware or software to load. Generally speaking, you have a browser that that we provide access to. You've got login credentials, and both the buyers and suppliers would have access to the same type of visibility. And so that platform would be the basis upon which your ERP messages, so your P21 system is in the middle, and then the SourceDay collaboration platform envelopes that. And then the solutions that we provide, and I'll just focus on PO for today, but I do want to point out the fact that we do have a couple of different solutions here. A request for quote management. So if you have an organization that goes out to suppliers frequently for new quotes, we provide a platform for that. Purchase order collaboration is the primary solution that we're going to talk about today. So I'll defer that for just a moment. We also provide accounts payable collaboration, so automated AP. And I'll pause there for just a moment for a safe harbor statement. Today, SourceDay is ERP agnostic, meaning that we integrate with a number of ERP platforms out there, P21 being one of them. In fact, the Epicor products in general are one of what we call the core four. So we've been integrating with Epicor products for quite some time, which frankly is one of the reasons that the company had attracted me. I had some familiarity with the Epicor solutions, of course, and recognizing that there was an integration here made it a very easy transition for me. I will pause here for a second, however, and point out the fact that the AP automation is not yet available for P21. So I won't go too far on that topic, but we do have development plans. And in fact, we've already started some of the development work. In 2022, we will be offering AP automation. So it's on the horizon. We've already invested in that process, and it will be available at the beginning of 2022. And then, of course, we have some high-level quality capabilities. Most organizations, in my opinion, will use the embedded quality capabilities within P21. So when you're doing your purchase order receipts, you'll do a pass-fail of the products. You'll check your material certifications, MSDS sheets as necessary, check them off and move forward. But we do provide quality as part of that PO collaboration as well. So that's the infrastructure, right? And then, of course, above all of that, the umbrella is that we provide insights, analytics, reports to help manage the results, right? I talked about benchmarking and the evaluation success plan during my opening statement. So I'm going to revisit that topic in more detail, but we recognize the importance of two things, right? One, if there's a business challenge that we can solve, what is the business impact of us solving that, right? What is we recognize that there needs to be some monetized value that we can provide. And so we do provide that. And again, I'll get into more detail in just a few moments, but that serves not only as an ROI review, but also an ongoing benchmark effort. So we will stand behind the business case that we're going to put together and share with you to monetize that business value. And then we hold quarterly business reviews to measure our performance against that business case. So more to come on that. That's a little teaser there. And then now that we have an understanding of the infrastructure, the reporting and the analytics that sit on top of that, the secret sauce, if you will, for your success is our ability to guarantee supplier adoption. So unlike the scenario I talked about earlier with EDI, where you may have a handful of suppliers that you conduct EDI transactions in a bidirectional nature with, what we would do is we play nicely with the EDI solution, and so those are not mutually exclusive. You can have your top several suppliers running EDI, and the Epicor, what is it, one EDI source, I think is the current EDI solution for most P21 customers. If you wanted to go that route, that would be for the top handful, and then SourceDay could potentially be used for the remaining 70, 80, 90% of your supply base. And so let's talk about that adoption guarantee for just a moment. We contractually guarantee supplier adoption for up to 80% of your direct spend. So what does that mean? That means that today, if you have $100 million in direct spend, you can look at your supplier list in a top-down type of approach, and wherever that break point is in terms of dollars, if 80% of that dollar value, if you're like most P21 customers, that represents about 20% of your supplier base. So that's what we would guarantee, that 80% supplier spend. And as you can see from this graph, that number of suppliers has risen pretty dramatically since 2018. And in 2021, we're currently sitting a few hundred suppliers above 9,000 globally, many of whom are in the Asia Pac region. So not only do we have domestic suppliers, but I would say close to 50% of our supplier base is outside the United States. Okay, and that just mirrors the suppliers that our customers would typically work with. More on that, and I'm sure there will be some additional questions there, but that's an important element because it differentiates SourceDay from other, and I'll use the air quotes, portals that you may have used or seen in the past, because we can guarantee that adoption because we provide the managed services that are necessary to onboard, train, and support your suppliers. So that's a headache you don't need to deal with. There's no cost associated with the supplier, and the benefits to the supplier are numerous. Most notably, of course, is the benefit that they derive from having a consolidated view of demand from their customers. Many of our SourceDay suppliers work with multiple SourceDay customers. All of their demand comes into one place, and it shows very nicely in rows and columns of information with color coding, et cetera, which you'll see during our product highlight session here in just a moment. But that is really key to your success. Being able to have your suppliers adopt the solution is critical to any supplier collaboration tool. And in my opinion, SourceDay does that better than anyone. Okay, so that's critical to keep in mind. All right, in terms of that AP process, and again, I won't spend time here because I know this particular tool is not yet available for P21 customers, but I think it's important to highlight the benefits that we're providing to other customers so that in 2022, you'll be able to take advantage of this. Automatically three-way match all of your invoices, so the three-way matched invoice, PO, and receipt will be done. Touchless processing and vouchering for all of those matched invoices. So by virtue of the fact that we're able to increase the accuracy of the purchase orders by keeping that collaboration straight, would by default improve or increase the number of invoices that will match first pass. And so the manual processing that your team would have to do is reduced significantly. And so typically, and I'll just build this out really quickly, most AP solutions, if you look across the bottom of your slide here, there's some uploading of the invoices done manually today. If you have an automation tool, generally about 60% of that can be managed. There's the match invoice PO to receipt, the three-way match process, as it's known. Generally, competing applications provide 80% match on that. And then, of course, the manual updates for vouchering and paying with no rekeying. And so top line here, for those customers of SourceDay that are using the PO collaboration solution in conjunction with AP, they're able to do a 93% upload automatically. They're able to achieve a 96% auto match rate. And then that results in touch-free processing of 96% of their AP invoices. I mentioned the customer testimonials. So with respect to that, you'll notice here with respect to Napoleon, this is one of our customers today. They're able to achieve 15% more on-time deliveries using SourceDay. 94% of their invoices matched and processed touch-free. So this is a SourceDay customer that is only working with 6% of their invoices, their vouchers, manually to process. Everything else has been automated. So you think about how much time your AP team deploys today to do that manual process and reduce that by 94%. Now you can free them up for more strategic initiatives, right? And then of course, additional benefits on the PO side in terms of revenue protection and cash flow optimization. We'll talk more about how we get there in just a moment. But just closing the loop on the AP discussion here, you'll notice over on the right, this is that customer we just talked about a moment ago. Over time, you can see the trend line at the top, and then they were able to achieve that 94% touchless rate in 3 months. Their finance team is now 97% paperless. They've been able to triple their cash discounts that they were able to take through early pay. And then they were able to shrink their month-end close from 2 weeks to 2 days in the AP area. And then, of course, it's provided them with some very easy audits as a result of leveraging those tools. So keep that on your radar. More to come in 2022 for the P21 customers. Don't want to get too far ahead of myself there, but I think it's an important benefit to consider if you start with purchase order collaboration, bring all the suppliers on board, and then decide to add AP automation later. There's an end game there. That was my key takeaway. So in terms of customer testimonies, we talked about the fact that we solve some of the business challenges that most organizations are challenged with today, and that is the supplier on-time delivery performance, and then that linear negative effect that would have on your business. And so what you see here is a customer testimonial, and I'll show you a couple here, high level, speaking to the business benefits that SourceDay is able to provide to them. So in this case, you can see Troy Mock, he's a director of global procurement at Global Interconnect, SourceDay customer. They managed over 300 suppliers during the COVID period with 0 factory downtime. That was pretty impressive to the team. They were very surprised and happy to be able to report that at the conclusion of implementing SourceDay in their environment. Another Epicor customer here, Chatsworth Products, and you see a quote from Spike McBride at the top of the screen. But the point that I will emphasize here are the outcomes at the bottom. These, I think, just speaks volumes to the business benefit that we can provide. They were able to reduce their work in process inventory by 66%, 70% reduction in supplier late deliveries. And as a result of that, they were able to reduce their safety stock and reclaim 90% of their warehouse space as a result. So Chatsworth Products, probably the poster child for performance in terms of SourceDay customers. And this is one of many raving fan customers of SourceDay that certainly we can share with you. And the list goes on, right? Here's Rocor, Tina Grow, IT director, 100% up-to-date purchase order data in ERP. You'll see how we do that in a moment. 19% improvement in on-time delivery, 90% supplier adoption. Put a pin in that real quickly here. I mentioned that we guarantee 80%. Currently, we're running just north of 90% across the board for existing SourceDay customers. And the reasons that I mentioned earlier, the benefits to the supplier are one reason for that. And this, in fact, is a supplier using SourceDay. This is SMC Corporation. And so I've been talking about SourceDay from a customer's perspective, but from a supplier perspective, being able to see all of their demand coming in from their customers into a single repository is very beneficial. And it enables our suppliers to save time, similar to those efficiency gains that your buyers should expect to achieve. So in this case, SMC Corp was able to regain 5 hours of their week as a result of leveraging SourceDay, and that additional time was spent on building customer relationships. So you think about that. If you can save 5 of your 40 hours of the administrative tasks that suppliers are performing today, and they're able to take those hours and reach out to their customers and improve that relationship, foster that transparent relationship. Another benefit, of course, could be reduced pricing as a result of those relationships that are continuing to develop. All right, so I just showed you multiple scenarios, multiple testimonials from customers speaking to the business benefits that SourceDay was able to provide them. So how do we get there? We talked about what the business challenges are we solved. We've got testimonies to support that. How do we get there? Well, some of the product highlights that I think are important, and I broke this down into a handful of what I consider to be the highlights for the business benefit. How do we get there? Like anything else, right? That you need to compare the effort required to accomplish something and then the benefit that you're going to derive from that. So put another way, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? So in this particular case, you're looking at a PO exceptions dashboard. This is a summary of all of the PO changes over time. And so that in and of itself is impressive, being able to consolidate those messages so that you can see all of the POs that need attention, right? What do we need to update? What purchase orders are currently hot as we've defined them to satisfy customers on time in full requirements? And then POs that are pending acknowledgement. If we have 74 purchase orders out there for which our supplier did not acknowledge the purchase order, that's a risk. And so we need to stay on top of that. This isolates the total, and we can then drill down into the lower levels to see those individual POs, lines, and releases. You can see your critical and at-risk orders in the middle, and then the suggestions down at the bottom. The suggestions are important because, number one, they summarize the totals. So you have a monetized view of all of the POs for which we need to expedite. That'd be the move-ins. The POs for which the demand has been relaxed represent the move-outs. So failure for us to communicate those changes to our supplier would result in us receiving material for which the demand doesn't exist for a couple of weeks yet, potentially. So we're tying up cash flow, right? In the move-ins, we're talking about revenue protection. So we need to make sure that we're expediting those requirements so we can ship and recognize revenue on time. The move-outs touch on cash flow, as I just mentioned, and then cancellations are pretty self-explanatory. If we have demand that's been canceled from our customers and we don't communicate that to our suppliers, we're going to receive product for which no demand exists. And so now we're just tying up working capital. And so revenue recognition, cash flow, and preservation of working capital are three primary value drivers of source day. Keep that in mind. We'll go into a little bit more depth on that. So what does the platform look like? In this case, you're seeing this happens to be from the buyer's perspective, but it's important to note that the supplier has an equal and opposite view of the same data. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see that this is a buyer view, and you can see buckets that represent those purchase orders that require updates, they're awaiting a response, pending, all of your open POs, late, etc. So you can see each of those segregated across the top. Clicking any one of those buttons provides visibility in row and column format, which most people are comfortable with, showing the purchase order details. You can look at the history. There are any changes that have been recommended by the supplier are highlighted in red so that the buyer immediately sees those exceptions. And the key takeaway here, and this is not just simply pulling purchase orders into one place so that buyers and suppliers can see it, although that has benefit. The real power here is the automation that's going on in the background. So for example, if a supplier has purchase orders, let's say there's 15 purchase orders that they receive from you, that those 15 purchase orders may have 5 to 10 line items per PO. And so what they can do is they can quickly look through the list of purchase order requirements, confirm the dates, quantities, and prices are correct, check all of the boxes on the left-hand side of the screen for those POs, and then the actions drop down just above that checkbox list provides the ability to submit those changes. That gets sent back to the buyer. It shows up in this window, and then the buyer can say, okay, they've accepted all of that. Let's go ahead and post any changes. That actually writes back to P21. It'll update the PO header, line, and release automatically based upon that buyer review. This is secondary, I should point out, to any approvals that exist in P21 for purchase order thresholds, buyer limitations, et cetera. We still recognize all of that, of course. And then, of course, any changes that take a purchase order over a threshold will go through that approval cycle again. Takeaway here being that it's a very clean view. And then this may not seem like a big deal, but you'll notice in the middle of the screen here, source day versus non-source day vendors. I mentioned that we provide contractual guarantee for 80% of your direct spend, but we capture all purchase orders. So any purchase order that's generated at a P21 will fall into one of two buckets. The source day vendors will respond to those purchase orders, but you still have visibility to the non-source day POs. That's important, so we don't have two different processes to manage in the background. So this is an example of the buyer dashboard, which again is represented also in an equal and opposite viewpoint for suppliers. What does the supplier see? Well, number one, they can see the equal and opposite view that I just talked about, or they can see it in a more task-driven type of approach. And so what do I mean by that? In the right-hand side of your screen, you're looking at a list of new demand signals that have come from your P21 system to the supplier. And so if the supplier would prefer to use this view to the spreadsheet row and column view, they'll just respond in a chronological sequence here to these tasks that are represented. So what they will do is they'll look at the first PO, they'll see that there's a quantity for this particular product. If there's a vendor part number, they'll see that here as well. They'll see the demand, quantity, cost, and due date. And then the supplier has the ability to add comments and then propose any changes as appropriate. And so once they do that, they can confirm the purchase order, and that would be sent back to the buyer using that platform, which they would then review and accept. And they'll go through that list. In the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you'll notice multiple purchase orders are represented here. So what this means is that what we're doing is we're doing a 15-minute sync from P21, and we're consolidating all of the demand. So instead of sending your suppliers 50 emails, if we cut 50 purchase orders throughout the day, we'll consolidate them and identify what the frequency for delivery might be for the supplier. Maybe their preference would be just send me two releases a day, right? And we'll consolidate based upon those 2 releases. And they'll get that email, they click on the button for pending purchase orders, and that opens up this screen and or the dashboard that I talked about a moment ago. So very easy for suppliers to respond to those demands and changes to demand coming from your buyers. And then, of course, one of the key takeaways here is that we also provide suppliers with the ability to do advanced shipping notifications, right? This is a shortcoming of several of the Epicor products. P21 does a pretty good job of the ASNs. So the takeaway here is that you're not losing anything, right? We want our suppliers to be able to identify a tracking number and a barcoded packing list of the products so that one of 2 things can happen. We can either receive the products in our facility easier, and secondly, if it's a drop shipment to a customer, we want to know about that, right? So this gives you immediate notification that a product's been shipped, and you can click, as you can probably guess, on the tracking number to drill into the corresponding shipping method. So more than 200 carriers are currently integrated with SourceDay. And then just further definition of that, this is in terms of what they would see, we provide them with the tracking number and the labels and the barcoded packing list. Supplier scorecarding. This is a critical item becoming more and more important to organizations today, being able to manage your suppliers. So what you're seeing here is the SourceDay ability to aggregate all supplier metrics for acknowledgement rates, responsiveness, on-time delivery, and quality. So that's the global aggregate. And then each individual supplier has their own scorecard, which will show the direct spend dollars, how many PO lines that represents, what is their current acknowledgement rate, responsiveness rate, on-time delivery, and quality. And then they can click on the scorecard, and this provides equal visibility to both your buyers and your suppliers. So they'll have the ability to see something like their scorecard. Key takeaway here, I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory, the metrics that go into each of these. What's important to note is that the weighted variables or the attributes that go into each of these can be defined. So for example, if responsiveness is more important to your company than on-time delivery, just using that as an example, then obviously that may score higher for the overall score that you provide to that supplier. Key takeaway here is that both your buyers and suppliers have visibility to this. So again, it's all about transparency. And then I talked about the business case, very, very high level. The justification of the expense, of course, is something that every organization is going to have to do. You'll have to say, okay, here's the investment that we're considering, and here are the monetized values that go with that investment. Because we recognize, of course, you probably have a dozen or so or more projects that are competing for your capital. So what we want to do is be able to say, okay, here's the business challenge that we can solve. Here's what this is worth to you. Here's the investment in order to achieve that. And oh, by the way, we're going to use this as a benchmark going forward to identify, are we doing what we said we were going to do, right? And that can be broken down into a number of different categories: on time in full, Cost increase impact, this is your purchase price variance visibility. What is your result of cash flow protection as a result of utilizing source day? Lead time changes with different heat maps. And we can get into more detail here, but I'll just kind of flash through a couple of these. How do my lead times vary by item and supplier? So our data scientists are constantly working on the metrics here, and we're capturing this for you and presenting it to your team so that you can provide some benchmark comparative visibility month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year. And here you can see the cost increase metric that I talked about a moment ago. And then lastly, how many PO lines were on time and in full. So if we're at 66% over 16,000 purchase order lines versus 20,000 last year, it gives us a good comparative view of how we're doing year over year. And then we can compare those prior year values in terms of the percent of variance and median days late as well. And of course, the trend line is pretty self-explanatory. So if your on time in full percentage is rising up and to the right, obviously that's a good thing. We're keeping track of that, and we're providing that visibility so that you can see the value and the benefit that you're deriving from the source date platform. And so just a little bit deeper dive on that last topic. We're capturing those metrics so that you can maintain visibility of what good looks like and see which direction you're trending. As part of our evaluation success plan, I'll keep this very high level, but number one, does your organization have some of those business challenges that we solve? That's the first question. If not, that's a very quick stage gate go, no go, right? We would perform the business case analysis, perform the solution demonstration, and then just to make sure that we're aligned on the technology platform, we do an IT review and a workflow review. And that's really, number one, we'll send out an IT questionnaire. What's the environment look like? Some of the things that Daryl talked about in the beginning of the presentation this morning, right? We want to verify some of that. And then we'll have you walk through a purchase order flow from purchase order creation through receipt. Show us what that looks like in your environment, just so that we're comfortable that if there were any modifications done, we know what those are. So we'll walk through that as part of the evaluation success. This is an example of some of those inquiries that we will ask as a result of the business case preparation. So what release are you on? How many POs did you create last year? How many lines does that represent? What is the corresponding direct spend? How many of those were late in terms of either a quantity or percentage? As you can read the rest of those, I won't go through each one of them. But for P21 customers, we recognize, of course, that many companies have full-time buyers and or they have maybe some folks that are doing part-time buying and customer service work at the same time. So we're working with customers and suppliers, and so it's not a full-time equivalent. So we'll kind of take that into account as part of the licensing review. So we take all of that information based upon the results, and we put that into our business case analysis spreadsheet, for lack of a better word, and we're looking at your direct spend, we're looking at the average inventory value, PO lines created, et cetera, so that now we can take that information with some assumptive values that we've calculated as a result of our existing customer base, and we're going to impact your business in 4 different ways. Increased on-time delivery, OTD, faster inventory in terms of ITR, inventory turn ratio. On average, we increase our ITR by about a half a turn across the board for existing customers. Personal productivity, that's the efficiency gain. So any finance folks on the call here, and I know there are several based on the last presentation, we recognize, of course, that efficiency gains are more of a soft cost savings as opposed to some of the hard cost savings that we provide. But if we're able to save 10 to 15 hours per week per buyer, that's a significant savings in terms of personal productivity that now frees them up for more strategic initiatives. And then, of course, the customer order protection. So those are the 4 pillars that we impact, and we do so, and we're able to monetize that through our business case analysis. So each of those pillars are represented here, and they take into account some unique variables and attributes for your organization and some templates of assumptive values based on the results that we're providing to other customers. So this is just intended to show you where the details are coming from, and then the summary in the upper left-hand corner, totaling or aggregating the total source date benefit in comparison to an annual subscription based on how many buyers we're talking about, how many invoices, that type of thing. So my intent here is not to go too deep on the on what this is, but more importantly, the fact that we do go through this process to establish that benchmark so that we can measure success going forward. So I am right at a quarter of the hour. I know I've kind of gone through a lot of information in a short period of time there, but I'm going to open it up to any general questions that folks might have relative to the SourceDay platform, our company in general, or maybe any of the success criteria we're able to provide to other customers.
Okay, I have one. Anything special that you have to worry about with supplier setup in Prophet 21 to make sure SourceDay is used effectively, such as suppliers with multiple locations?
No specific setup requirement there. If you do have suppliers with multiple locations, we do support that, of course. You're going to have different purchase points. And so SourceDay recognizes the different purchase points, and we've got those connections set up in the background to identify from where we're buying material. So no special setup.
All right. How long does a typical integration take?
That will vary quite a bit from company to company, of course, but generally speaking, for P21 customers, we're looking at a 30 to 60 day integration and implementation process. And that typically we'll walk through that process with you after we go through the IT review. The only hangups that we typically see there that are preventing the 30-day process is, number one, our existing capacity, right? We've got customers that we're always onboarding, and we're flexing to grow as necessary. And then any customizations that you might have in your environment that would impact our because there's going to have to be some review prior to that. But generally speaking, 30 to 60 days for rollout, integration, implementation. And then the second part to that, which is typically done concurrent with the integration process, is about 90 days from inception to onboard the 80% of those suppliers. And so we'll start, as you can imagine, with the highest direct spend and kind of work through tranches down through that list until we get to 80% at a minimal. And then, of course, we're continuously working that list. You're getting new suppliers that you want to work with. We onboard those, we train them, et cetera. And so the turnaround time on that is very fast, usually same day on suppliers, so that we can initiate purchase orders and follow up with them as necessary. So all in, generally speaking, on the PO collaboration, 90 days from start to finish.
Awesome, thank you much, Jim. All right, another question came in. Is there a preference to implement SourceDay as part of the main P21 implementation, or to do it as a second phase after the base system is stable?
Excellent question. And we always advocate for the latter. We would want you to have your P21 system up, your users trained. You're going to create purchase orders using the standard P21 flow. And once you have you're live on P21, we generally suggest about a 30-day period before you think about integration with SourceDay. But we strongly suggest that it's a phase 2 consideration for obvious reasons there. For those reasons I just talked about.
Great, awesome. I have another one. So some of our suppliers are too big or too small to use a portal. How do you address that?
That's another very commonly asked question. We have, as you can imagine, distribution companies work with very small and very large organizations, the Fastenals of the world, the DigiKeys of the world, right? These are large. McMaster-Carr is another one that comes to mind. These are huge organizations. So the concern that some distribution companies have is that we're a small fish in this big pond. We're not going to get much traction there. And the key, my response to that in working with other customers is that we don't have to get those big monolithic organizations running SourceDay. What we need to do is bring on board the folks that you work with, the divisions that you work with most often, and we are very successful in that. So those companies that I just mentioned, Fastenal, McMaster-Carr, DigiKey is a big one on the electronics distribution side. We've got customers working with them. Those are suppliers of SourceDay, and we bring on other divisions as necessary around the world. Now on the small side, and I guess this is, the other side of that coin is that there are going to be suppliers that you work with that are very small. And in the distribution world, you know, you may have some folks that are still using, God forbid, fax machines and phone, right, instead of an ERP system of their own. And so I would say it would be unrealistic to suggest that we're going to have 100% supplier adoption, and there may be a couple that we're not able to onboard, but generally speaking, if they're in that top 80%, we will make it worth their while to do so.
Wonderful. All right, another question came in. What are the minimum technology requirements for your suppliers to be able to use SourceDay?
Another good question. So the only requirement is you need internet access. Doesn't even matter what browser you're using, but you need internet access. And we will provide you with a username and a password and a URL address. And then once you have internet access and a browser, you can start working with SourceDay. So there's no cost and no hardware investment for the supplier.
All right, and another one. You mentioned ASN tracking by SourceDay, or tracking details imported automatically into P21, so other stakeholders not in the SourceDay portal can view tracking and ASN details.
Another good question. And so by default, the ASN information is not imported into P21 today. That is on the roadmap, by the way. However, we also provide viewer licenses. So those folks that are not using SourceDay still have visibility to that. And what I've seen in live environment is that the ASN would be delivered with the shipment, and it's barcode enabled. So it uses 3 of 9 and 128 barcode symbology, which is the most common for the Epicor P21 solution. And then you could use that as the basis for receiving goods into P21. Now, again, safe harbor statement, this is in the roadmap, but in 2022, one of the elements that we are adding is that integration. Today, you can export from SourceDay into a CSV file and import into P21, but I wouldn't consider that an integration. What I think most companies would want is a push button integration, so it automatically goes from your supplier to the P21 system without an import export type process. So it's coming.
Awesome. So we have a couple that I'll pocket for the roundtable discussion. I'm going to let everyone take a break, and then we'll come back and get that started. And we'll go ahead and launch our next poll. And then we'll see you guys back here at 2 p.m. Eastern. But feel free to send any questions in the meantime. And that is just a screensaver. Nobody's actually getting a virus uploaded. So we had somebody ask that yesterday. So just wanted to ease anybody's mind. right, we're gonna give you guys a few more seconds to answer that poll. And then we will get to some other questions that came in. And let's see, let's answer a couple of questions that came in earlier, and then we will share these results and sort of address that as well, if that works for everybody. Hopefully it does, because I guess you can't really tell me if it doesn't. I won't be able to hear you. Okay, so let me go ahead and pull up, since we were already talking regarding source day last, Jim, I'm gonna just piggyback on that with a couple of questions that we had come in. How can source day guarantee supplier adoption?
Good question. So I talked about the fact that we will contractually guarantee 80% of that direct spend, and I've outlined how we measure that, right? How we get to 80%. So those 20% we continue to work on. Now, how we get there, the managed services is really the secret sauce, right? That entire team, we've got a full staff of managed service folks that's their whole role in life, is to onboard, train, and support those suppliers. So that's the differentiator for SourceDay. That is the tool that we would use, the vehicle to guarantee that success, is that it is a full-time job for a team of people to do just that. And so what we do as part of that process, kind of a subset layer here, is that when we communicate with those suppliers, we do a demonstration for them, and we show them how we would make their lives easier as a result of using the platform. We have them walk us through, how do you manage your customer today? So for example, I'll just use a fictitious P21 customer sends in 25 purchase orders over the course of the week. How do you manage those? And of those, oh, by the way, half of them are going to be updated. How do you follow up on all of that? And immediately everyone starts digging through their emails, right? So we immediately show them, here's the platform that we would use to minimize that. So the managed services is our secret sauce to your success. And we do that by providing value to the suppliers.
Wonderful. And I've got one more for you. And then I believe we've got a couple for Daryl that have come in, unless any more SourceDay ones come in. How does SourceDay provide supplier access to drawings, specifications, packaging instructions, etc.?
Yep. So one of the things that I didn't talk about when we were looking at that buyer dashboard is the fact that every PO line and release can have attachments associated with that. Doesn't matter what the file type is, doesn't matter what the file size is. So when that purchase order is generated and populated in the SourceDay platform, suppliers have the ability to view them live on the supplier side of that platform, and then they can also print them as well. So that would include your packing list, drawings, specifications, MSDS sheets, material test reports. So that is a bi-directional flow. So if as a distributor you require MSDS sheets or material test reports, certs of conformance to be supplied with the goods, that can be uploaded to the platform as well. So in real time, your customers get access to that.
All right, it does not want to let me share the round table slide, so we'll just all look at our faces in the front and center. All right, Daryl, I had one come in for you just a moment ago. Does the web hybrid client contain all the same functionality as the legacy client, or do you lose functionality when you move to the web hybrid?
That's a great question. So it's kind of a mixed bag. The answer to that is depends on the functionality. So the legacy client, as Epicor has stated, is not undergoing future development. So there are features that are becoming available in the web/hybrid client that you're not going to be able to use in the legacy client. On the flip side, if you have been using a legacy modification or a customization, and that's not yet available in the web/hybrid client, then you're going to be stuck in the legacy client until that customization can be ported over to the web client. So it really depends. Are you talking about old customizations and old features? Then you'll probably stick with the legacy. If you're going with the new stuff, looking for the latest and greatest cutting edge, the web reporting, for example, that's only going to be in the web client and not in legacy client. So it's a mixed bag. Depends on your customization.
All right, thank you. Oh, I think we've got another one that okay. I'm concerned my user base will struggle with adoption of the web client. Can you run both the web and legacy client at the same time while the users catch up?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As long as you're on version parity, right? That your legacy client and your web client are running the same version of P21, you can run them against the same database. And what we actually have clients do is they are using a pilot for the web client. So they tell their users, here, try the web client. Let's see how it works. Go through your day job with the web client. And if it fails for whatever reason, it could be, performance, it could be functionality, it could be training, then stop using the web client and go back to the legacy client to get your day job done. But that way you can kind of, speed through adoption, unless you've got folks that are willing to be dedicated testers, which usually isn't the case, because testing folks only know a small subset of P21 usually, and they'll test what they know to test. Whereas your knowledge workers, your folks on the floor, they need to get their day job done, so they usually are your testers. But yes, you can absolutely roll out both, and in fact, you can have both running on the same computer at the same time.
I believe that answers another question. Can I run both legacy and web clients together? If there's anything to elaborate on there, let me know. We also got a question, what's the biggest server impact between using the legacy client and the web client?
So the server impact, ultimately at the end of the day, it all ends up in your SQL server. So your SQL server is going to see this about the same level of work, whether it's coming from the end user legacy client or it's coming from the middleware client. However, as you move from the legacy client to the middleware to the web client, that middleware server is going to start taking the brunt of user interactions. And so what we see is the middleware server's got to get beefier as you go to the web client. So you might not even have a middleware server if you're still legacy, and you're still in that two-tiered solution I mentioned. As you move into the three-tier solution, you start using the web client or the hybrid client. They're really equivalent in terms of their functionality. That middleware server is going to get a bigger hit. So you need to keep a closer eyeball on that.
All right, another one for Jim. Does source data integration differ whether you are or not using the middleware server?
There are some setup criteria that are different for sure, but as far as the integration itself, no. The components of the integration are the same.
All right. Thought we reached the bottom of the barrel. Here we go. Are Dyna change actions available in the web version? Does the web version change anything in terms of how reports are generated?
I'm going to defer to my functional guys on that one.
That's a good question. I think we'll have to follow up on that one. I'm not familiar with that.
Terri?
Yeah, Dyna-Change does work in the web. You have to do some conversion, and there are instructions for doing the conversion. But otherwise, yes, they do work. And what was part B of that question?
Does the web version change anything in terms of how those reports are generated, Terri?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
All right. I think that was the bottom of the barrel, unless we have any others come in. We'll wait a few moments so we're not jumping the gun too soon. But thank you, while we've got a chance to say that, thank you for coming to today and being so interactive. It was nice to see so many questions come in and see what you guys are looking for feedback on. So yeah, I guess we'll wait a few more moments, see if any questions come in. And of course, we will be sending you links. So if you want to share this with any team members, watch it again, etc., feel free to let me know if you don't receive one, but that should be going out so you can review that and share with your team members. And as always, I'm always interested on what you guys want to see in these. So if you have something on your wish list, for lack of a better term, let me know. It's a great opportunity to get some free education for your team if there's an area that you want us to try to present on. So ask and you might receive. All right, well, thank you for coming. We'll hang out here for a few minutes offline. Just ping us, we'll be available for a few moments. If nothing happens, we'll sign off, but we're here for a few more moments if you are shy and want to ask a question in a moment when everything kind of shuts down.
Thank you for your time, folks.